The war in Afghanistan lasted 20 years, from 2001 to 2021. More than 170,000 American soldiers rotated through its mountains and valleys. Over 2,400 never returned home. 20,000 came back wounded. And yet, even those numbers do not tell the full story. Afghanistan is a land where empires go to die. Alexander the Great fought here. The British tried 3 times. The Soviets bled here for a decade. For centuries, the mountains of the Hindu Kush have absorbed blood, tragedy, and war without end. And some battles never truly end. Their echoes keep reverberating long after the last shot is fired. My name is Marcus Chen. They called me Doc, a combat medic with the 47th Infantry Battalion. October 2010, Kunar Valley. My second deployment. Our forward operating base was called Sentinel, a tiny fortress built out of HESCO barriers and concrete bunkers, clinging to a slope that overlooked Taliban supply routes. On the maps, it looked strategic. In reality, it was a coffin waiting to be filled. What those maps didn't show was that Sentinel stood on layers of history. Soviet trenches from the 1980s ran underneath our feet. Beneath those, even older British positions from the 19th century. Generations of soldiers had dug, fought, and died in the same soil. We were a small team, but tight. Sergeant Rodriguez, hardened by 3 tours in Iraq. Thompson, a 19-year-old radio operator from Alabama who still tried to catch country music on military frequencies. And Miller, our designated sniper, a quiet man from Montana, the kind of soldier who could hit a coin from 800 meters without blinking. Life at Sentinel was a rhythm of violence. Mortar attacks were routine. Enemy snipers shadowed us daily. But those dangers, they almost felt normal. What disturbed me wasn't the Taliban. It was the silence between the attacks. A silence that seemed too heavy, as if something unseen was listening, waiting. It was October 15th, 2010. Showed 2:30 hours. A cold night in the valley. I was on watch in the northern trench of Sentinel, the sector we called Alpha Post. Beside me, Thompson monitored the radio in silence. The temperature hovered just above freezing. The wind carried the faint smell of snow from the mountains mixed with distant coal smoke from villages hidden in the dark. That was when I heard it, whispers. At first I thought it was the wind twisting strangely through the trench walls. But no, I knew the sound of the wind. This was different. These were voices, low, hushed, as if several people were conversing just beyond the earth-packed walls of the trench. The sound slid along the dirt, impossible to pin down. I froze. My heartbeat quickened, each breath clouding in the cold. Thompson paused his radio, listening but claimed he heard nothing. I insisted. And then, it became undeniable. The whispers were real. They shifted, moved, sliding from one end of the trench to the other, as though invisible figures were pacing just behind the walls. I grabbed my NVGs, scanning every shadow, every rock, every ridge. Nothing. No movement, no heat signatures on thermal. And yet the voices continued for 10 long minutes. Sometimes they sounded like Dari, the local language. Other times, Russian. Once, only once, but clear as day. I swore I heard English. British English. The voices fell silent the moment Thompson attempted to report activity to command. As if they knew. As if something was listening not just to us, but to our radios too. That night marked the beginning. The moment when silence in Sentinel was no longer empty, but full of something unseen. Watching. Waiting. The next morning, during the routine briefing at 0600, I mentioned the whispers to Sergeant Rodriguez. He brushed it off immediately, saying lack of sleep could make the mind invent things. He wasn't wrong. We were operating on barely 3 to 4 hours of rest each night. Hallucinations, visual or auditory, were not uncommon in combat zones. But still, Something about those voices felt too distinct, too intentional. Thompson was restless. He couldn't shake what he'd heard. His only conviction fueled my own unease. That was when Miller, our sniper, spoke. Quiet as always, but his words cut through the room like a blade. He recalled an old story. In 1984, the Soviets had sent a company into the very same valley. 120 men entered, only returned 12. The rest vanished without explanation. According to local villagers, the land itself had swallowed them. Rodriguez dismissed it as superstition, but Miller had spoken with Habib, our interpreter. Habib was an Afghan in his 50s, a man who had lived through the Soviet and the years of Mujahideen resistance. He knew every legend the mountains carried. When I asked him about the whispers, he grew silent, his eyes fixed on the peaks that surrounded us. Finally, he spoke one word, Rawanona. It was a Pashtun term, the restless spirits of warriors who still guard their posts. That night, October 16th, I was on watch again, this time in the southern trench Bravo post with Rodriguez by my side. The air was cold, the valley is unusually quiet, and then the whispers returned. But now they felt sharper, more urgent. I swear I heard my name carried in them, faint, almost imperceptible, yet clear enough to twist my stomach into knots. Marcus. Marcus. No one on base called me by that name. Everyone knew me only as Doc. Only a few in my unit even remembered my first name. Rodriguez freezes. He heard it too. His instinct was immediate, to grip his rifle, scanning the darkness with suspicion. But no matter how many times we swept the perimeter with thermals, no life signs appeared. The whispers weren't coming from outside the wire. They were bleeding out of the very walls of the trenches themselves. That was when I realized we weren't just fighting an enemy we could see. Sentinel was built on something older, something that had been here long before us. And maybe, just maybe, something that had never left. October 18th, 03 hours, my third night of whispers. This time I was alone in Charlie Post, the Eastern Trench. Rodriguez had ordered solo watches to confirm if the phenomenon would continue. It did. At first, the voices were faint, like before, but gradually they grew louder, clearer, distinct. There were 3 of them. One spoke Russian, another English with a British accent, and the third was unmistakably American. Sector clear, the American voice repeated. Contact, contact, the Russian whispered. Stand firm, lads. Hold the line, the British one urged. Different armies, different eras, yet all reporting from their posts as if the war had never ended. Then, movement. Through my night vision goggles, I saw it. A shadow gliding along the opposite trench. Not a man. Not exactly. Translucent, like dense smoke given form. It carried a rifle, but the weapon seemed half dissolved, corroded by time itself. I froze. My throat went dry. The figure stopped and turned to face me. Through the green glow of the goggles, I saw where its eyes should have been. Instead, 2 cold points of light, like emerald lasers drilling into me. I reached instinctively for the radio, but before I could transmit, more figures emerged. One seeped out of the trench wall to my left. Another materialized at the far end of the line. All armed, all watching. The air dropped in temperature so suddenly I could see my own breath. My hands shook violently. My muscles refused to respond, as if I'd been pinned in place by some invisible weight. The voices around me grew louder, overlapping, clashing in different tongues. Enemy contact, take cover. Ambush, hold the line, do not break. It was as if 3 separate battles were happening at once. Echoes of wars long past still raging in the same cursed ground. One figure came closer. I could see details now. A Soviet uniform, helmet, insignia barely visible. An AK-74 gripped in its phantom hands, the metal rusted and incomplete. It raised the weapon and pointed it directly at my head. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My voice cracked in a desperate whisper. I'm American, a soldier. The shadow tilted its head as if considering. Then, slowly, it lowered the weapon. The others followed. And then came the words. Not in Russian, not in Dari, not even in English as we know it, but clear enough to pierce through me. Another generation, another war, when will it end? And just like that, they vanished. The cold faded, the whispers ceased. The trenches returned to silence. But I remained frozen there, trembling. Not from the cold, from the truth I had just witnessed. The dead had not left. They were still at their posts, still fighting battles that ended decades, even centuries ago. When relief finally came, I could barely speak. My voice cracked as I called over the radio, requesting immediate extraction from Charlie Post. Within minutes, Rodriguez and Thompson arrived. The look on their faces said everything. They saw the terror in my eyes, the pallor in my skin. They didn't need me to explain. They knew something had happened. The next morning, our commanding officer called a meeting. I expected disbelief, laughter, maybe even punishment for what would sound like madness in a combat zone. But instead, silence. The captain admitted that we were not the first unit to report anomalies at Sentinel. The soldiers who occupied the post before us had written similar accounts in their logs. Of course, none of it appeared in the official reports. Some things the Army prefers to bury. Within 72 hours, orders came through. FOB Sentinel was to be abandoned, officially for logistical concerns. Unofficially, I think they knew. The ground itself was haunted. On our final night, all of us stayed together at Alpha Post. The whispers returned one last time, louder than ever. But this time they felt different. Not hostile, not urgent, almost grateful, as if the restless dead were finally saying goodbye. FOB Sentinel was officially deactivated on October 25, 2010. Rodriguez transferred out within weeks. Thompson moved to communications in Bagram. Miller finished his tour early. And me? I completed my deployment. But I never served again on bases built over historic battlefields. Years later, I came across an academic article on military archaeology in Afghanistan. It mentioned the valley where Sentinel once stood. Over a century and a half of battles, British, Soviet, American, all bleeding into the same soil. The article included photographs of artifacts recovered there, Soviet helmets, British bayonets, even American shell casings, 5.56 caliber. The strangest part? Our unit never fired our weapons during our stay at Sentinel. To this day, I wonder if those echoes remain. Soldiers from different nations, different centuries, still keeping their watch. Bound to the trenches, bound to their duty. Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires, perhaps more literally than we can ever understand. Some soldiers never truly leave the battlefield, and maybe, just maybe, they recognize other warriors when they see them. So if you ever serve on ground soaked with centuries of blood, pay attention. Listen closely, because sometimes the whispers aren't just the wind. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. See you soon.